Hi, this is Tim Guy here to talk about my 4 STEM resources and my review of each. The first one I want to talk about is my podcast. So the podcast that I chose is called STEM Every Day. It is a podcast for teachers, and it's all about how to infuse STEM into your everyday classroom. So it's a lot of pretty practical advice. They do interviews. They talk about classroom structure ideas. They go over lessons. And what I really like about it is that they go pretty deep in terms of their ideas. It's not just, hey, here's a couple lessons to think about for STEM. It's a lot of the discussions about if you're doing STEM in your classroom, what are some of the difficulties you might come upon? What are some of the positives that might come out of that? How do you get student interaction that you want? Some of the more specific things that come up when you're doing STEM, they kind of discuss that during the podcast, at least during the episodes that I watch. What's really nice is they do a bunch of interviews on the podcast, and it's not always like pro people. I listened to one interview where they talked to a professional who had been doing STEM for a really long time and some of the things that he had gone through. But they also talk about other things for like new teachers who are just trying out STEM or the new to STEM, and what are some of the difficulties that come through that. And I think that that's a really important thing to listen to. And I think that one of the things that really kind of shapes my understanding or my STEM identity is how it talks about the importance of kind of the trial and error STEM, and how when you're doing STEM, not everything's going to work out perfect, and you got to kind of persevere through that. And I really like that it kind of talks about that a lot. The next one I want to talk about is a book. Now, this book's a little bit weird of a choice because it's actually a nonfiction book. It's a science fiction short story compilation called Exhalation, written by Ted Chiang. Basically, they're a bunch of short story science fiction stories that are optimistic in nature, which is pretty different for most science fiction. But science fiction is pretty negative in terms of the way the stories come out to make them interesting. But these all kind of like an optimistic spin to them. And one story in particular that I think really applies to STEM in general is the story about, it's called The Life Cycle of Software Objects, where basically the main protagonist of the story, she works for a company that creates they're kind of like artificial beings. They're described as being like animal shaped, but whatever they are, and how over the course of the story, she's constantly looking for ways to improve them and make them more realistic, and she kind of befriends them, and then it gets a little bit into like the ramifications behind that. But it talks a lot about the importance of the iterative process, and how really it's inductive reasoning that she's going through. Now this is happening, and here's I can do this. And I think in general, even beyond that, a lot of these stories, because of their optimistic spin, they really talk about how technology can really change the world, and how it's capable of improving our lives and making things better, and really affecting everything around us, not just us, but just all the things that surround us. And that human ingenuity is a cause for good in the world. And I think it really shows me that teaching kids to think like scientists and do this inductive learning, how that really can make a difference on what's going on. So I think it's a really good book. If you get a chance to read it, it's really, really interesting. For the place that I went to the Hands-On House. This is a children's museum for ages 1 to 7. I actually went with my daughter. She's there in the picture down here, having fun. So what I really liked about it is that at the Hands-On House, they have a lot of activities that teach about different science processes. So like one example I have written here is that they have a whole section on bees, and they kind of go through like, here's the beehive, and here's where the bees fly to, how they pollinate flowers, and then how this can turn into fruits, and they kind of go through the whole like process of that with plants and things involving bees. And it's really a way for kids to kind of act that process out. Now, what I also really like about them is it's pretty leveled for kids. So like my daughter, she's 2, so she's not going to get the whole like, oh, bees doing whatever, but they have she can just play with the stuff and kind of get some of the motor skills. She actually really there's like a chicken exhibit. She got to count all this stuff out, and that's more on her level. But I think I wanted to show this because it's a really great resource for anybody who teaches kindergarten or first grade. I think that's kind of for school age, what would really be there for you, or those with young kids. And for me, in terms of how it affects my STEM identity, I think it shows that STEM and inductive learning really is our natural learning process. It's how we naturally learn things. My daughter goes through and she's hands-on with stuff, and she's like, oh, look, Daddy, I'm doing this or this. And it's really just kind of natural that she's learning that way, and it's really why we should have it more in our classroom. The last thing I want to do is a movie, and I'm sure almost everybody's seen this movie. It's pretty popular, October Sky. It's a story about a group of high school kids in West Virginia, and they become interested in rockets, and they go through and they start like a rocket club, and they build rockets in a rocket competition. But because they're in a rural West Virginia town, their family's coal miners, and it's really kind of a fight between the kids and their dads about whether, it's good to be spending time on this or whether they need to quit school. School's really important. And I really suggest this for everybody to watch, not only because it's an entertaining movie, but it also shows really how important teachers are. And it kind of ties into why I suggested it and how it affects my learning or my STEM identity is that, the teacher in this story, she's not the one who gets them interested in rockets necessarily, but she kind of is their advocate and fights for them throughout the story, kind of to make them keep up with the rockets. So I have a little quote I put here. It's not really a quote. It's something I wrote down that I feel about what this movie's saying is that we might not be the ones who set the spark for our kids, but we can provide the fuel to keep it burning. And what I mean by that is that we might not find that interest for our students, but when they have an interest, if we can tie that into what we're doing and kind of pull on that, we can really make it so that they keep wanting to do what's going on. So those are my 4 reviews. Hopefully you check out these resources.